My son forgot to hang up the phone. I heard, he has to go to a nursing home. I didn't say anything. They sold the house for $890,000. They returned from a business trip, smiling until the key fit. On the doorstep, they found a note, and when they read it, they started screaming. I'm 71 years old. I spent almost 40 years teaching third grade at a public elementary school, the kind of job where you learn to read a room full of children in about 4 seconds flat, learn which ones are lying about their homework and which ones are just scared of getting it wrong. I raised my first husband's son, my only child, mostly on my own after his father passed when the boy was young. I remarried later in life. A good, quiet man I'll call my second husband, and we had 11 good years together in the house I still think of as mine, the one with the wraparound porch and the garden out back that I built with my own hands over 3 decades of Saturday mornings. My second husband passed 2 years ago now, quietly, in his sleep. After the funeral, the house went silent in a way I hadn't felt since I was a young widow the first time around, decades earlier. I still caught myself some mornings making 2 cups of coffee out of habit before I remembered there was only one of me now, and I told myself I was fine, and mostly I was. But there's a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house after a death, and it doesn't go away just because you've decided to be brave about it. My son called me every Sunday like clockwork, 10 minutes of small talk about work and my garden and whatever was on the news that week. I looked forward to those calls more than I probably should have admitted. About 5 months after the funeral, he showed up at my door on a Tuesday afternoon, not a Sunday call day, and I felt a small flutter of worry before I even opened the door, the kind you feel when your grown child shows up unannounced. It turned out to be neither, or maybe both, depending on how you look at it now. He was standing on my porch with his wife beside him, both of them smiling in a way that seemed, at the time, like nothing but kindness. I had no idea standing there in my own doorway that I was looking at the beginning of something that would end with a locksmith changing the locks on a house I'd lived in for the better part of my adult life, and a letter taped to my own front door with my son's name written across the front. I just saw my boy home for a visit, and I was glad to see him. Mom, you shouldn't be out here rattling around this big house by yourself, my son said, standing right there in my kitchen with his hands in his pockets, the way he'd stood as a boy whenever he wanted something and wasn't quite sure how to ask for it. We were talking about it. Why don't we move in for a while? Help you out, keep you company, save some money on rent while we're saving up for our own place down the road. His wife nodded along beside him, smiling that warm, agreeable smile she had. The one I would come to understand much later was doing a great deal of quiet work in that kitchen that afternoon. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. That matters to the rest of this story. I wasn't tricked into that first yes. I was lonely, and I missed having voices in the house besides my own, and my son was standing in front of me offering exactly the thing I hadn't let myself admit I wanted. Within 3 weeks, they had packed up their apartment across town and moved into the 2 spare bedrooms upstairs, the ones that had sat empty since my second husband passed, the ones we'd once briefly hoped might belong to grandchildren someday. For the first few months, I want to say clearly, it really did feel like a blessing. My daughter-in-law cooked dinner most nights, real meals, the kind I hadn't had the energy to make just for myself in longer than I wanted to admit. My son fixed the loose porch step and cleared the gutters before the fall rains without me ever having to ask him. We sat together in the evenings and watched whatever was on the television, and for the first time since the funeral, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. I told my neighbor across the street that I was the luckiest old woman on the block, having my own son look after me the way he was. I had absolutely no idea that the man smiling across my dinner table every night was already, quietly, counting down the months until this house belonged to somebody else, and it wasn't going to be me. I look back now and can see it all laid out clean and simple, like a map somebody drew after the fact. Back then, all I saw was a son and a daughter-in-law settling into a routine, and a widow grateful, finally, not to be alone. I want you to remember that trust, because it's the exact same trust that made everything after hit as hard as it did. By the 6th month, small things started to change, the kind of things you brush off at first because you don't want to believe what they might mean. My daughter-in-law started calling the house ours when she talked to her sister on the phone in the kitchen. A small word, easy to miss, except I didn't miss it. Not really. I just chose not to say anything about it. She replaced the curtains I'd hung years ago without asking me first, said the old ones were letting in too much dust, though the old ones had been just fine the week before. My son started bringing up money more often, asking about my pension, my savings, whether the house was fully paid off, which it was, free and clear, had been for years. I didn't think much of it at the time. A son should know these things about his own mother, I told myself. That's what I kept telling myself every single time one of these moments happened, because the alternative explanation was one I wasn't ready to face yet. One night at dinner, my son mentioned an old coworker of his whose mother had recently passed, and how the coworker had turned around and sold her house for close to $900,000. Prices out here are just unbelievable right now, he said, looking around my kitchen while he said it in a way that made the back of my neck go cold, though at the time I couldn't have told you exactly why. I remember setting down my fork for just a second too long. My daughter-in-law started inviting a realtor friend of hers over for coffee not long after that, a pleasant enough woman who I thought at the time was simply being neighborly, stopping by for coffee and conversation the way friends do. I would find out much later that this same realtor had already walked through my entire house and given my son and his wife an estimate on it, weeks before I ever poured her a cup of coffee at my own kitchen table. At the time, none of it seemed worth making a fuss over. Each moment on its own was small enough to excuse, easy enough to explain away as the ordinary friction of 3 adults sharing one roof. I keep circling back to that because I want you to understand that none of it arrived all at once. It arrived in inches, the way most betrayals do. you, one small comment at a time, until one day you look up and realize you've been standing in a completely different room than the one you thought you were in. Around 8 months in, my son started saying things like, "Mom, you're forgetting more than you used to," even in moments when I hadn't forgotten a single thing. I misplaced my reading glasses once on a Tuesday, the same way I had my entire life, the same way anyone does. And by dinner that evening, he was telling his wife across the table, as though I wasn't sitting right there listening to every word, that he was starting to get worried about my memory. I laughed it off the first time. "Everybody misplaces their glasses now and then," I told him, and he didn't laugh back. He gave me this small, patient smile instead, the kind you give someone you've already decided isn't quite tracking anymore, and something about that smile stuck with me longer than it should have. He started insisting on driving me to my own doctor's appointments after that, even though I had driven myself to those exact appointments for over 50 years without one accident. He would sit in the exam room and ask my doctor pointed questions about cognitive decline and early warning signs, questions I had not asked and did not need answered, in a tone that suggested he already had the answers and was simply waiting for the doctor to catch up. My doctor, to her credit, kept looking at me instead of him when she answered, but my son kept right on asking. I started noticing that he'd bring up small, ordinary lapses in front of other people too, at church, at the grocery store, in a light, almost joking tone that somehow always managed to plant a small seed of doubt in whoever was listening. "Did I tell you Mom left the stove on again the other day?" he'd say. And I hadn't left the stove on, not once, not that week, or any other week, but the story would land anyway, the way stories do when they're told with enough casual confidence. I started to feel, for the first time in my long life, like I was being quietly built into a case, though I couldn't have said for what. Not yet, not with any certainty. I want to be clear that none of this felt dramatic while it was happening. It felt small. It felt like the kind of thing a devoted, worried son does for his aging mother. And if you'd asked me at the time whether I trusted my son, I would have said yes without a moment's hesitation, because I did, because that's what mothers do. We trust our children long after the evidence has started quietly piling up against that trust. One small comment, one worried glance, one gentle correction at a time. Not long after that, the pamphlet started appearing on my kitchen counter, soft, warm lighting on every cover, smiling gray-haired actors holding hands over checkered tablecloths, playing cards in sunlit common rooms, walking arm in arm through gardens that looked nothing like any garden I'd ever tended in my life. The names alone told you everything you needed to know about who these places were built for and who was meant to pay for them. Golden Pines, Sunset Meadows, places with names designed to sound like a gentle ending rather than what they actually were, which was a very effective way of emptying somebody's bank account while making them feel grateful for the privilege. When I asked my daughter-in-law about them, casually over coffee, she waved a hand and said, "Sweet as anything. Oh, those are just for research in case we ever need them down the road." Down the road, that was the exact phrase. And I remember it precisely because the softness of it, like she was describing a scenic detour rather than putting me somewhere I hadn't chosen, made the whole thing feel worse rather than better. I didn't argue with her. The reason matters more than it might sound like it should. I didn't want to be the paranoid old woman who accused her own family of something ugly over a stack of glossy brochures on a kitchen counter, because that's exactly how it would have sounded out loud, and I knew it. And some small, humiliated part of me was afraid that if I said what I was actually starting to suspect, everyone in that house would look at me like I'd finally, truly lost my grip on things. So I kept quiet. I kept smiling. I kept thanking them for looking out for me, the way you're supposed to thank people who are, on the surface at least, only trying to help. But something in me had already shifted by then, quietly, underneath all that smiling and thanking. Nearly 40 years of watching children invent small, practice fibs with perfectly straight faces had left me with a particular instinct for it, and that instinct had started paying very close attention to every word coming out of my son's mouth and every word coming out of his wife's, cataloging all of it, quietly, the way you catalog evidence when you don't yet know what case you're building, only that you're building one. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in April. I'd gone out to the garden shed looking for a trowel I hadn't used in months, just puttering around the way older folks do on quiet weekday afternoons, when I heard my son's voice coming from the direction of the kitchen through a window I'd left cracked open earlier that morning to let in some fresh air. He was on the phone, and from the low, fast way he was talking, I could tell right away that he believed he was alone in the house. I stood very still with the trowel in my hand, and I listened. "No, listen," he was saying. "The doctor already said her memory's declining. That's on record now. That's what we need. Once we get her into Golden Meadows, the paperwork practically signs itself. We're not talking about kicking her out. We're talking about her needing care she can't get living alone with us working full-time." I stood frozen in that shed doorway, my heart pounding so loudly in my own ears, I was certain he'd hear it clean through the wall between us. He kept going, and I kept listening, and I didn't move so much as an inch. The realtor already ran the numbers. With the market the way it is, we're looking at right around $890,000 for the house, maybe more if we list before fall. That covers her care for years and leaves plenty left over for us. His wife must have said something back, something I couldn't quite make out through the glass, because he laughed, an actual laugh, easy and unbothered, and said, "She has to go. That's just the reality of it. It's not personal. It's what makes sense for everybody. She has to go." 4 words. She has to go. I stood in that shed for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 2 minutes, and I did not make a single sound. I did not drop the trowel. I did not gasp or cry out or do any of the things you might imagine an old woman doing in a moment like that. I simply stood there and let those 4 words settle into me, all the way down, the way cold settles into a house in the middle of winter, and I understood, with a clarity I hadn't expected, that everything about my life in that house had just changed completely, even though from the outside, standing in that shed doorway in the April sun, absolutely nothing about the scene had changed at all. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. My very first instinct, standing there in that shed with the trowel still in my hand, was to march straight into that kitchen and ask my son exactly what kind of man says she has to go about his own mother, the woman who raised him mostly alone, the woman who had just heard him talk about her house, her care, her entire remaining life in the same flat, practical tone you'd use to describe getting rid of a car that had failed inspection. But I didn't do that. I set the trowel down as quietly as I'd picked it up, careful not to let the metal clink against the shelf, and I walked back through the yard, and I sat down on the porch steps in the April sun, as though nothing in the entire world had just happened, even though everything had. I sat there for a long while, watching the light move across the grass, feeling strangely calm in a way that almost frightened me, the way you feel calm sometimes in the exact center of an emergency, before your body has caught up to what your mind already understands. Nearly 40 years of standing in front of a classroom full of children teaches you something valuable, and it isn't how to diagram a sentence or explain long division, though I taught plenty of both over the years. It's how to keep your face calm and pleasant when somebody in front of you is lying, so that you have time to figure out exactly what's really going on before you say a single word out loud that might tip your hand too early. I had used that skill on 8-year-olds for decades. I never once imagined I'd need to use it on my own son. So that night at dinner, I ate my daughter-in-law's cooking and asked my son how work had been. Same as always, same easy tone, same interested nod. I did not mention the shed, or the call, or Golden Meadows, or the $890,000, or the fact that my own son had just described getting rid of me in the same breath he used to describe covering his own future expenses. I smiled, I passed the bread, and underneath all that smiling, something in me had gone very quiet and very still and very, very focused. I did not sleep that night, not for one single minute. I lay there in the dark in the bed I'd shared with my second husband for 11 years, listening to the ordinary sounds of the house settling around me, the sounds I'd heard so many thousand nights that I usually didn't hear them at all anymore. And I went over every single polite little comment my daughter-in-law had made about those brochures, every doctor's appointment my son had suddenly started attending uninvited, every casual question about my pension and my savings and whether the house was paid off free and clear. It all lined up now, every single piece of it, in a way it hadn't seemed to line up before, back when I was still choosing, whether I fully admitted it to myself or not, to see each of these moments in isolation, rather than as parts of a single, coherent shape. The curtains that suddenly needed replacing, the realtor who'd shown up for coffee like a friend, and then vanished from conversation just as quickly. The way my son's voice changed, just slightly, whenever the subject of the house came up at dinner, a kind of careful lightness that I now understood was calculation dressed up as casual conversation. Somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning, lying there in the same house I'd called home for decades now, the house where I had raised the very son who now apparently wanted me gone from it, I made a decision. I was not going to yell. I was not going to accuse anybody of anything. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly where I actually stood, legally and otherwise, because accusations without proof would only give them the exact ammunition they needed to paint me as confused, paranoid, unstable, a woman whose memory could no longer be trusted. I was simply going to find out the truth of my own situation before they ever had the chance to make a single move against me. By the time the sun came up, gray and ordinary through my bedroom curtains, as though the entire world hadn't just tilted sideways underneath me, I had a plan forming. Rough and incomplete, but real. The first real plan I'd had since my second husband passed, and the house had gone so quiet. I got up, made coffee, got dressed for the day like any other Friday, and inside I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, which was the quiet steadiness of a person who has finally stopped being surprised and started paying attention. The following Monday, I told my son I had a doctor's appointment across town, which wasn't entirely a lie since I did eventually see a doctor that week, just not that morning. I drove myself there in my own car, and instead of the doctor's office, I drove to see a lawyer, a woman recommended to me years earlier by a parent from my old classroom, somebody I trusted, with no connection whatsoever to my son or his wife. I sat across from her desk and told her everything, plain and in order. The phone call I'd overheard in the shed, the pamphlets, the questions about my pension. She listened without interrupting once, taking careful notes on a legal pad, and when I finished, she pulled up the county property records right there on her screen, turning it slightly so I could see it too. This house is deeded solely in your name, she told me. Just yours. No one else is on that title. And unless you've signed a power of attorney or some other legal document giving someone else authority, nobody can sell this house, admit you to any facility, or touch a single dollar of your money without your consent. I remember feeling something in my chest loosen slightly at those words, the first real relief I'd felt in days. Then she asked me a question that made my stomach drop right back down again. Has your son asked you to sign anything recently? Anything he described as insurance forms or medical authorizations? Anything that seemed routine? And I remembered it instantly. A stack of papers my son had left on my kitchen table roughly 2 weeks earlier, telling me they were just updated insurance documents that needed my signature for the records. Nothing urgent. I hadn't signed them yet. I'd kept meaning to get to it, kept putting it off because I don't sign anything without my reading glasses and a clear head, an old habit that, it turned out, may have quietly saved me. The lawyer asked me to bring those papers in as soon as I could, and 3 days later I did exactly that, sitting across from her desk again with the folder in my lap, feeling foolish for how long I'd let it sit untouched on my kitchen table. She read through the pages slowly, carefully, and confirmed exactly what we had both, quietly, already suspected before she'd even finished the first page. They weren't insurance forms at all. Not one word of it had anything to do with insurance. What I was holding was a durable power of attorney, drafted in careful legal language designed, I imagine, to look boring enough that nobody would read it too closely, giving my son full legal control over my finances, my healthcare decisions, and my home the moment I signed my name at the bottom of the last page. If I had signed those papers on the night he left them on my kitchen table, everything he and his wife had discussed through that kitchen window, the house, the sale, the money, Golden Meadows, all of it, would have been entirely, legally within his power to arrange, with or without my continued agreement. I never signed it. I want to say that plainly because it matters. I never signed it, and I never will. But finding it, holding those pages in my own two hands, and understanding exactly what they were meant to accomplish, changed something fundamental in me. I wasn't just an old woman being quietly talked about behind her back at the dinner table anymore. I was a woman whose own son had tried, deliberately and with some care, to trick her into signing away control of her own remaining life on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, disguised as a piece of routine paperwork. For one long, strange afternoon, sitting in that lawyer's office with the truth finally laid bare, I felt something close to relief, the false, temporary relief of a person who believes the worst part is now behind her simply because she finally understands the shape of the threat. I thought foolishly that knowing was going to be enough, that I could quietly refuse to sign and keep living exactly as I had been, and that would be the end of it. I did not yet understand that knowing was only the beginning of what I actually needed to do. My lawyer helped me understand my actual options over the following weeks, and she recommended a realtor she trusted completely. A sharp, no-nonsense woman who worked out of an office clear across town and had a reputation, my lawyer told me, for moving houses fast and quiet when her clients needed real discretion. I met the realtor at a small coffee shop a couple miles from my house, somewhere I was fairly confident nobody in my family would ever wander into, and I paid for both our coffees in cash, and I told her plainly that I wanted to sell my house without my son or his wife knowing anything about it until the entire thing was already done. She didn't ask me why. She just nodded. The kind of nod that told me she'd heard some version of this story before, more than once, from more than one client sitting across a coffee shop table from her with the exact same careful, guarded look I must have had on my own face. She told me the market in my neighborhood was strong enough right now that a house like mine, updated kitchen, good bones, sitting on a solid piece of land, could realistically bring in close to $900,000 if we moved quickly and moved smart. I opened a brand new bank account at a credit union clear across town that my son had no idea even existed, and I had my mail quietly redirected to a post office box I rented under my own name, and I started meeting the realtor every single Thursday afternoon while my son and his wife believed, because I told them so, that I was simply going to physical therapy for my knee. For the first time in months, sitting in her small cluttered office going over listing paperwork, I felt something I hadn't felt since long before my second husband passed, which was the simple, steady feeling of being the one holding the cards in my own life again, and I can't properly explain to you how much better that felt than I ever expected it to. Every Thursday, I drove across town with my knee brace still strapped on from the actual therapy appointment I did attend beforehand, just to keep the story airtight. And every Thursday, I came home an hour later than the therapy alone would have taken, and nobody in that house ever once asked why, because nobody had any reason yet to suspect the quiet old woman upstairs had started, very carefully, planning her own way out. To keep my son and his wife relaxed and completely unsuspecting, I did something that still makes me smile a little even now, thinking back on it. I let them take me on a tour of Golden Meadows, the very place they'd been quietly steering me toward for months. I walked through those hallways with the soft, artificial lighting and the faint smell of lemon cleaner underneath something else I couldn't quite name, nodded politely at the laminated activities calendar pinned to a corkboard near the entrance, and even told the tour coordinator, with what I hoped sounded like genuine warmth, that the dining room looked lovely, all while knowing perfectly well that I had absolutely no intention of ever setting foot in that building again as anything other than a visitor. My son looked so pleased in the car afterward, telling his wife on speakerphone as we drove home that Mom seemed really open to it, that I almost felt a small stab of sorrow for him, for the version of him that still believed this plan was working exactly the way he'd designed it. Almost. That feeling didn't last very long at all. Meanwhile, my realtor had listed my house under a private, discreet arrangement that never once showed up on any of the large public websites my son or his wife might casually stumble across during an idle evening of scrolling. She marketed it instead through a small, trusted network of serious buyers, word of mouth only, the kind of quiet channel that moves houses without ever making noise. Within 9 days of that listing going live, we had 3 separate offers on the table, each one more serious than the last. The best offer came from a young couple expecting their first child, people who fell completely in love with the backyard, the same one where my son had played catch with his own father decades earlier, back before any of this began. Their offer came in at $890,000, all cash, with a flexible closing date and no contingencies. Exactly the kind of clean, fast deal my lawyer had told me from the very beginning to watch for and grab without hesitation. I sat in my realtor's office and signed that purchase agreement argument with a hand that was steadier than I honestly expected it to be, thinking the entire time about my son's voice through that kitchen window, saying she has to go, like it was the easiest, most obvious decision in the entire world, like I was a piece of furniture that had simply stopped matching the room. Well, I remember thinking, as I signed my own name at the bottom of that agreement, somebody does have to go. It just turns out it isn't going to be me after all. About 2 weeks after I signed that agreement, my son came home from work practically glowing, the way he used to look as a boy when he got picked for a team he desperately wanted to be part of. His company was sending him and his wife to a conference for 8 days, all expenses covered, and his wife was already talking excitedly about hotel amenities and a nice dinner they had booked somewhere downtown for one of the evenings. It's actually perfect timing, Mom, my son told me over dinner that night, with absolutely no idea how right he actually was about that, in a way he never could have anticipated. While we're gone, you should think more seriously about Golden Meadows. Maybe even put down a deposit before we get back, get the whole thing rolling properly. I told him I would think about it. Same calm, easy voice I had been using with both of them for weeks now, and inside my own head, quietly, I was already doing the math. My realtor and I had already confirmed that closing could happen in as little as 12 days once both sides signed off, and the young couple, eager and fully reapproved, were ready to move the moment I gave the word. My son and his wife left for the airport on a Sunday morning, suitcases lined up by the door, his wife reminding me 3 times to water her orchids. I stood on the porch and waved as my son's car pulled out of the driveway, the same driveway he'd ridden his bicycle down as a boy. And the second that car turned the corner and disappeared, I called my realtor and told her one thing: let's move the closing date up before they ever get the chance to come home and stop what's already in motion. The closing happened 4 days into their trip, on a Wednesday morning, in a small conference room at the title company. The young couple sat across the table from me, the mother's hand resting on her round belly, both of them practically bouncing in their seats with excitement about raising their child in that same backyard where my son had once played catch as a boy. I signed page after page, feeling a little lighter with every single signature. And when it was finally done, my realtor handed me a check for $890,000, more money than I had ever seen gathered together in one place in my entire life. I had already found my own new home by then, a bright, independent living condo about 30 minutes away, mountain views out nearly every window, a small woodworking shop in the basement I could use whenever I liked. Nobody chose that place for me off a glossy brochure. I chose it myself, walked through it myself, paid for it in cash myself, and signed my own lease with my own 2 hands. I spent that Wednesday afternoon and all of Thursday with 2 movers I'd hired quietly weeks in advance, packing up 40 years of my life, photographs off the walls, the quilt my own mother had made me as a young bride, folded carefully into a box lined with tissue paper, everything that actually mattered to me, and I left the rest behind for the new owners, who were thrilled to take the furniture off my hands for a fair price. Before I left that house for the very last time, I sat down at the kitchen table my second husband and I had eaten breakfast at for 11 straight years, and I wrote one final letter. Not to be cruel, only to be honest. I taped it to the front door where I knew my son's key would fail to turn, right at eye level, in an envelope with his name written across the front in the same handwriting I'd used to sign his report cards decades earlier. I told him I knew everything. I told him I'd been standing in that garden shed with a trowel in my own hand when I heard him tell his wife on the phone that I had to go, and that I'd heard him talk about $890,000 like it was already spent before the ink on any agreement had even dried. I locked the door for the very last time, got into my car, and drove away from that house without looking back once in the mirror. My son told me later, though I didn't hear any of this from his own mouth until weeks afterward, that he and his wife pulled into that driveway on a Sunday evening, still tan and relaxed from their trip, his wife already talking about unpacking and checking on her orchids. My son walked up to the front door with his key already in hand, the exact same way he'd done it 10,000 times before in his life, and his key wouldn't turn. He assumed at first it was simply jammed, jiggled it, tried again, called out to his wife that something was wrong with the lock. That's when a young mother opened the door from the inside, confused, a newborn baby resting against her shoulder, asking my son who exactly he was and why he was standing there trying to force his way into her house. According to my neighbor, who watched the entire scene unfold from his own front porch across the street, my son stood frozen on the steps for a long, silent moment before he finally noticed the envelope taped just beside the door frame, his own name written clearly across the front. My neighbor told me his wife read the letter first, standing right there on the front lawn in the fading evening light, and that her hands started shaking about halfway through the first page. She said my son grabbed the letter out of her hands when she couldn't finish reading it herself, read the rest of it standing there alone, and that's when the screaming started, right there on the lawn, loud enough that 3 different neighbors came out onto their own porches to see what on earth was happening. My neighbor told me his wife dropped straight to her knees on the grass. My son just stood there holding that letter, staring at a house that no longer held a single thing inside it that belonged to him anymore, in front of a young family he had never met before in his life, on a street he had genuinely believed he would own free and clear within a matter of months. My phone started ringing about 4 minutes later. I didn't answer it, not that first night. My son called me 31 separate times over the following 3 days, and I let every single one of those calls go straight to voicemail, not out of any real cruelty on my part, but because I wanted him to sit with exactly the feeling he had been so ready and willing to hand to me without a second thought. On the 4th day, sitting out on my new balcony with the mountains slowly turning orange in the evening light, I finally picked up the phone. His voice cracked the very second second I said hello. Mom, please, we didn't mean it like that. We can fix this. Just tell us where you are. I let him talk for a good long while. Let him work all the way through the apologies and the excuses about stress and money and how things had simply gotten away from both of them somehow. When he finally stopped talking, I told him the truth as plainly as I knew how to say it. I told him I'd heard every single word of that phone call back in April, that I knew about the power of attorney disguised as harmless insurance paperwork, that I had known exactly what Golden Meadows and $890,000 had meant to him and his wife for months before I ever said one single word about any of it out loud. I told him I wasn't going to yell at him because he was still my son and I still loved him, but that love had never once meant I owed him a house I had spent decades of my own life paying off, especially not after he had decided, on his own, without asking me anything at all, that I had to go. I told him the door wasn't completely closed, not forever, but that it would only open again when he was finally ready to see me as his mother again, and not as $890,000 standing directly in the way of his plans. I hung up the phone, set it down gently on the table beside my coffee, and looked out at those mountains one more time, feeling, for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, completely and finally at peace with everything that had happened and everything that was still ahead of me.